I'm Natalie Klein. I'm 47 years old, and I've spent 26 years in the United States Army in work I rarely got to talk about. Building a career that most of my family couldn't see clearly, which meant for a long time they couldn't quite see me clearly either. I showed up to every gathering, every holiday, every summer BBQ in Fauquier County with a plain blouse and no rank on my collar, because I thought keeping my career out of the room was a form of kindness. But when my cousin, a county sheriff's deputy, slapped handcuffs on my wrists in front of the entire family at the summer BBQ over a parking dispute, and not a single person in the yard said a word, I stopped making myself invisible. I made a different choice. Have you ever been humiliated by someone you kept showing up for, year after year, because you believed the relationship was worth it? If that's familiar to you, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stop shrinking yourself for people who weren't even paying attention, hit that like button and subscribe. I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, the oldest child of Robert and Sandra Klein. My father spent his career in insurance underwriting, a quiet, careful man who moved through the world with a kind of methodical patience that I recognized in myself only later, when I understood that it had been transmitted rather than chosen. My mother taught third grade for 22 years at an elementary school 3 blocks from our house. She retired in 2003 when her knees gave out and spent the years afterward gardening and attending every family event with the commitment of someone keeping a ledger. We were not a military family. Nobody in the Klein line had served since my grandfather's brother, who came home from Korea and never spoke about it. We were a Sunday dinner family, a Christmas at Carol's farm family, a 4th of July at the Harmons family. Gatherings were the structure of our year. My mother's sister Carol had married Donald Harmon in 1974 and moved to a 40-acre property in Fauquier County when I was 4 years old. From that point on, the Harmon farm became the center of the extended family's social world, the gravitational pull that everything else orbited. The property had a farmhouse, a barn, a split-rail fence that ran the length of the front field, and an oak tree by the eastern fence that I spent an unreasonable amount of my childhood sitting under. We gathered there for every holiday, every graduation, every occasion that needed a large outdoor space and somebody willing to manage the grill. Don Harmon was good with a grill. He was a steady, decent man who didn't say much and fixed what was broken and died in 2019 of a cardiac event he'd had no symptoms to warn him about. I think about him sometimes. I loved that farm as a child in the uncomplicated way you love a place before you understand that places carry history. I know every fence post on the property. I know the way the afternoon light falls across the back field in late summer. It comes in at an angle that makes the grass look like it's lit from underneath. I know the smell of the oak tree after rain and the particular quality of quiet on the property at dusk just before the fireflies come on, when the insects haven't yet started and the birds have finished and the whole 40 acres holds its breath for a moment. Those are true memories. I keep them separate from what happened there last July because they belong to a different time and they deserve to stay intact. My cousin Derek Harmon is 8 years younger than me, Carol and Don's eldest. When he was small, he followed me around that farm the way small children follow older cousins who seem to know things they don't, with a combination of reverence and relentless, exhausting questioning. He wanted to know everything. How far away were the Blue Ridge Mountains on a clear day? Whether horses actually recognized individual people or just recognized familiar smells. Whether I thought there were fish in the drainage pond behind the backfield. He was a curious, bright, energetic kid with an enormous amount to say and no particular filter for when to say it. I was patient with him. I was 10 when he was born, and having someone follow me around asking questions felt less like a burden than it might have, and more like a small, daily acknowledgement that I knew things worth knowing. I left for the University of Virginia in the fall of 1996 on an Army ROTC scholarship. The scholarship covered tuition and fees and came with a monthly stipend that I used mostly for books. My parents were proud and quietly bewildered in equal measure. My father asked twice what I would do when the 4 years were up, and my mother bought me a new bedding set for the dorm in a color I did not ask for, and hugged me for an unusually long time at drop-off. I was 18 years old, and I already knew with the particular certainty of someone who has found the thing they are built for before they have the vocabulary to name it, that I was not going to leave the Army after 4 years. But I kept that to myself. It would have required an explanation I didn't yet have the language for, and it would have worried them in a way I wasn't prepared to manage. ROTC was straightforward for me in the way that things are straightforward when you are doing what you are actually supposed to be doing. I did well in the classroom, and I did well in the field exercises, and I did well in the leadership labs, and my cadre noted the pattern without making a large production of it. I graduated in the spring of 2000 at 22 years old and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army Military Intelligence Corps. My parents attended the commissioning ceremony at the university. My mother cried. My father shook my hand first, and then, after a moment, hugged me. Derek was 14 years old, and it was a school week, and nobody had arranged for him to come. I did not think much of it at the time. The summer before my commission, in 1999, was the last summer I spent at the farm as a purely uncomplicated member of the family. Before the compartments fully formed, before the work that couldn't be discussed became the dominant fact of my professional life. Derek was 13 that year, old enough to have moved past the purely small child questions into something more genuinely curious. He asked whether I would carry a weapon. I said probably not often, that my work would be more analytical. He asked what that meant. I told him it was like solving puzzles, the kind of puzzles other people needed solved, without always knowing who was doing the solving. He thought about that and said it sounded like being a spy. I said something like that. He seemed satisfied by this. We sat against the oak tree as the evening came on and watched the fireflies begin to appear in the back field, first one, then several, then too many to count. And I remember thinking that this was a good evening and that I would return to it many times in harder places, and that turned out to be exactly right. The work in military intelligence is not like the work in the movies. It is painstaking, analytical, often deeply unglamorous, and it operates largely in the background of events that other people eventually read about in the news. I was good at it from the beginning in the way that some people are simply well matched to a profession before they have fully developed the skill. There is a baseline aptitude that either exists or doesn't, and in my case, it existed. I could hold large amounts of information in working order. I could identify patterns that were not immediately visible in the data. I could make assessments under time pressure without letting the urgency degrade the quality of the thinking. My supervisors noticed this early. My assignments grew more complex. My clearances expanded in stages. By the time I deployed to Iraq in 2003, at 25 years old, I was a captain doing intelligence analysis for a special operations task force whose existence I could not confirm in any public setting. I came back in 2004 with a performance record that was classified above the level at which most of the Army operates, and I went to a family BBQ that summer in a plain dress, and my mother asked whether it had been hot. This is not a complaint. I want to be clear about that. The trade-off between operational importance and personal visibility was one I made deliberately, with full understanding of what it would cost, and I haven't regretted it. I believe in the work I do, and I believe in the institution I do it within, and I would make the same choice again in every year I have lived. But it did create a structural problem with my family that compounded over time. And I want to be honest about that, because honesty is what this story requires. The more significant my career became, the less I could discuss about it. And the less I could discuss, the more the family filled in the blank with whatever made intuitive sense to them. To my parents, I worked in some kind of government analysis job involving computers and information. To my aunts and uncles, I was in the Army, which was vague and honorable and not something they had a framework for. To Derek, who was 12 when I deployed to Iraq and 20 when I came back from Afghanistan the first time. I was the cousin who had picked a mysterious, invisible career path, while he had picked a clear and visible one. Derek joined the Fauquier County Sheriff's Office in 2010 at 24 years old. He went through the academy with strong marks and a lot of drive, and Carol threw a graduation party for him at the farm with the energy of a woman who had been waiting a long time to celebrate one of her children. The whole family came. I drove 4 hours round trip from Fort Meade, where I was then assigned, to be at the ceremony and dinner. I congratulated Derek sincerely, and I meant it. Law enforcement is real work. It carries real risk. The job requires genuine skill and genuine courage on a daily basis, and nothing that came later changes that assessment. I was not performing pride at that party. I genuinely felt it. What I noticed that day and across the gatherings that followed over the next several years was the specific way Derek's badge changed how he moved through a room. He began wearing his duty belt to family events, even when he was off duty. Service weapon holstered, badge clipped to his waistband, the whole configuration of visible authority present even at a picnic table. He began inserting himself into minor disputes with a calm, practiced authority that the family received as expertise. A fence line question between neighbors, a parking disagreement, a noise complaint from the people 2 doors down the road. He was good at projecting certainty. He knew how to lower his voice slightly when explaining something, which has the effect of making listeners lean in, and he knew how to let a pause work for him. These are real communication skills. I recognized them because I taught versions of them to junior officers throughout my career. The difficulty was the hierarchy that Derek's authority implied, a hierarchy in which visible, certified, publicly recognized service meant something, and invisible, classified, impossible to discuss service meant considerably less. He had the badge. He had the county behind him. He had the community around him who knew his name and what he did. I had, as he began putting it across the years, in various formulations, always lightly, always with a small smile, a vague government thing that nobody quite understood. He said it the first time around, 2013. I was a lieutenant colonel by then. I had recently returned from a second deployment, this one to Afghanistan, running an intelligence operation that had contributed materially to several significant counterterrorism outcomes that would eventually appear in heavily redacted form in congressional testimony I was not permitted to attend. I was drinking iced tea on my aunt's porch, and Derek said, with the particular lightness of someone who wants credit for saying something without wanting the responsibility of it, "I never understand what you actually do over there. Have you ever tried explaining it to people?" I let it pass. I let the next one pass. I let the ones after that pass too, because I have spent a career in environments that require patience with things that cannot be immediately addressed, and I was good at patience. But I was keeping a ledger of my own, and I knew it. By 2019, the dynamic had been established long enough to feel like weather, something you dress for without examining. Uncle Don passed away in the spring, and the family gathered at the farm for the funeral in the days that followed. I drove down from Washington on a Saturday morning in civilian clothes because I hadn't had time to stop at home and change, and I sat with Carol for most of the afternoon and let her talk about Don. The way he'd fixed the fence line every spring, the particular way he laughed, the trip to Maine they'd taken for their 40th anniversary, and how he'd complained the whole time about the lobster prices. I was a brigadier general by that point, a 1-star, but I hadn't told the family, and I was wearing a cardigan and slacks, so there was nothing to indicate this in any visible way. Derek was 33 that year, a senior deputy, and he ran the gathering the way he'd run it for a decade, greeting people, positioning himself at the center of each conversation, handling the neighbor who came to the fence about a parking situation with his badge visibly present. I sat with Carol and held her hand and let the afternoon be what it was. After most people had left, Lily Harmon found me near the oak tree. She was 13 years old, quiet in the way some children are quiet, not shy, but watchful, taking in more than they're given credit for. She asked me a direct question. What did I actually do? She asked it the way she might ask a teacher to explain something rather than the way adults asked it, which was always with the undertone of not expecting a satisfying answer. I told her I worked in intelligence analysis, that I led teams of people who gathered and interpreted information that other people used to make important decisions. She asked whether it was hard. I said yes, some days very hard. She said it sounded like it mattered. I agreed that it did. I gave her a card before I left with a secondary contact number on the back, and I told her to use it if she ever needed to reach me and couldn't get through on my cell. She was 13 and she filed it away without drama, and I drove back to Washington thinking about her, which was not something I had anticipated doing. I was promoted to Major General in 2022. 2 stars, command of an Army intelligence center with 12,000 military and civilian personnel and an operational mandate that I am not going to describe in this account. It is the most significant command I have held and the most significant I expect to hold, and I want to say that clearly not for the purposes of establishing importance, but because the shape of what happened at the BBQ requires it. My aide-de-camp from that point was Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, 40 years old, 22 years of service, 3 combat deployments, and a quality of operational calm that I have seen in very few people at any rank. He was assigned to me in June of 2022 and has been present for every significant event since. I will not explain Webb's qualities at length because the moment at which those qualities became visible is the point of this story, and I would rather let you see it than describe it. The summer BBQ of 22 was the last gathering I attended before the one I need to tell you about. I drove up to the farm in jeans and a plain blouse, same as always. Derek greeted me at the driveway with a handshake, 2 beats too long and with a fraction of extra pressure that I noted the way I note most things, quietly and without comment. Later in the afternoon, I was talking with my uncle, by marriage, about Virginia state budget allocations and their federal interaction. I had been briefed on the relevant funding mechanisms the previous month and had useful context. And Derek stepped between us, physically, and redirected the conversation to a county planning dispute he had been following. He did it smoothly, the way he did most things. Nobody in the group noticed anything. I ate my potato salad and went home at 7 and sat in the parking lot of a gas station outside Charlottesville for about 10 minutes before I felt ready to drive on the highway. I knew sitting there that the arc of that relationship had been decided. I just wasn't ready yet to act on what I knew. The July 4th weekend of 2025 arrived the way those weekends always arrive. With good weather and a cooler full of food and a set of low expectations dressed up as tradition. My personal car was in the shop. I rented a sedan at Reagan National and drove directly to Fauquier County from the airport, having flown in that morning from a readiness review at another installation. I had been awake for most of the previous 72 hours. The BBQ was the first unscheduled afternoon I had allowed myself to claim in 3 weeks, and I was genuinely looking forward to it in the small, specific way you look forward to a thing when you are very tired. Not with enthusiasm, but with the knowledge that rest is available if you can reach it. I arrived in the early afternoon. The main driveway was already full, so I parked the rented sedan at the edge of the gravel near the fence line and went inside to find Carol. She was in the kitchen making potato salad from a recipe she has made every July for as long as I can remember. We hugged. She looked well, better than she had at Christmas, more color in her face. I told her so. She asked about my trip. I said it was fine and that it was good to be there, and both of those things were true. Lily found me in the backyard not long after. She was 19 now, back from her first year at James Madison, taller than she'd been at Christmas, and more certain of herself in the particular way of people who have recently discovered what they're interested in and have had a whole semester to start becoming it. She talked about her international relations coursework for the better part of an hour, a professor who had spent 8 years at the State Department and taught negotiation theory like it was a living discipline, a seminar on intelligence sharing frameworks between allied democracies, a paper she was writing about information asymmetry in diplomatic contexts. I listened. It was genuinely interesting. It was the best part of the day. The afternoon went normally for a while after that. The food was good, Carol's potato salad, ribs that Derek's wife had contributed, somebody's watermelon that nobody had cut properly, but that tasted fine despite the presentation. The weather was warm without being punishing. A few cousins were there with their small children, and the back field was full of the particular noise that a field should be full of on a July afternoon. I was relaxed in the way you can be relaxed when you are tired enough that vigilance is not available as an option. I ate corn, I drank iced tea. I sat in a folding chair and let the afternoon carry me. The Carters next door, an elderly couple who had been on that property since Carol and Dawn moved in, sent their son over around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He was perhaps 40, polite, apologetic in the way of a person delivering information they didn't generate. He knocked on the gate post and said that someone had parked on the shared easement between the 2 properties and could it please be moved. He pointed at my rental car. I was already standing up. I said of course I was sorry, I had not realized it was shared. I would move it right now. Derek got there first. He stepped between me and the Carter son with the ease of a man who had been positioning himself between people and situations his entire adult life. And he explained to the Carter son that this was not a problem and that he would handle it. The Carter son nodded once, politely, and went back to his property. Derek turned to me. His duty belt was on, as always. His badge caught the afternoon light. I will not give you the full transcript of what followed, because most of it did not contain anything worth preserving. What I can tell you is that the exchange escalated in the way that exchanges escalate when the ostensible subject is a small thing, and the actual subject is everything that has been accumulating for years. He asked whether I thought the rules applied to me. He asked whether my government job made me feel untouchable. He said he was tired of people who built their identity on invisible authority and expected the people around them to simply defer. He said he was tired of it at work, and he was tired of it at home, And he was tired of it here, in his family, where certain people seemed to think they could show up twice a year and collect goodwill without earning it. The family had gathered in the loose, scattered way that families gather when raised voices draw attention, but nobody wants to be seen watching. I counted 9 adults within clear earshot. None of them said anything. I said, for the 3rd or 4th time, that I was going to move the car. I said it calmly. I started to walk toward the driveway. Derek grabbed my arm. He said, "You think your little government job makes you special? You've always thought the rules don't apply to you." And then he put handcuffs on my wrists, in front of every person at that gathering in the backyard of my aunt's farm, on a July afternoon with the charcoal still burning and someone's child laughing somewhere in the back field, the sound of it high and entirely indifferent to what was happening near the fence. I heard the click of the mechanism engaging. I looked at my wrists. I looked at the handcuffs. I took one slow breath. I said quietly, "You'll want to remove those, Derek," he said. "Or what?" I did not answer. There was no answer worth giving. I have spent 26 years in situations that required waiting with my hands open and my expression neutral until the situation resolved itself. Because I understood that time and information are almost always sufficient and that escalation almost never is. I turned and stood near the fence in the July sun, and I waited. What followed was 40 minutes. They were not the most difficult 40 minutes of my life. That distinction belongs to a situation I am not going to describe here, in a country I'm not going to name. When I was 37 years old, and the information coming across my desk required decisions that had direct consequences for people in the field. Compared to that, standing in a Virginia yard in July was nothing. But they were among the most clarifying 40 minutes of my life, and I want to try to explain what I mean by that. The family dispersed and regrouped in the specific way that families do when they have collectively chosen not to act and are managing the social weight of that choice. Aunt Carol sat down at the picnic table and looked at her hands. Rick, a cousin in his mid-40s who had been standing closest to me during the argument and had asked Derek quietly whether this was really necessary, turned away and started a separate conversation. My uncle by marriage, Don's younger brother, who had always been one of the more decent presences at these gatherings, walked toward me once with the expression of a man who is trying to locate words, and then turned and walked away without finding them. A cousin I see perhaps twice a year came over and told me, in a low voice, that the whole situation was just a lot, which I took as the limited sympathy it was intended to be, and acknowledged accordingly. Other than that, silence. 9 adults, and not one of them intervened. Derek, meanwhile, keyed his radio and called in what he described as a civil detainment for obstruction. He gave his badge number. He described the situation to the county dispatcher in the professional, flat cadences of someone who has called in reports for 15 years. The dispatcher acknowledged. The county record now contained this event, which would become significant in the days that followed. Lily said nothing to me during those 40 minutes, which I did not know at the time was because she had slipped away from the gathering entirely. She went behind the barn, I learned this later, and stood with her back against the old wood siding in the July heat and took out her phone. She had the card I'd given her 6 years earlier, the one with the secondary contact number on the back. She'd kept it in her phone case all this time, which I did not know. The number rang twice. A calm voice answered. Lily explained carefully and without crying, though she told me later it was close, what was happening at the farm. She gave the address. The voice on the other end asked her to confirm the county. She did. The voice said, "We'll be there." She told me all of this over coffee in September, and I told her she had done exactly the right thing, and I meant it with everything I had. I stood near the fence for 40 minutes. The sun moved, the charcoal burned down to gray. I watched the driveway. At 3:47 in the afternoon, a dark government vehicle came up the gravel and stopped behind the row of family cars. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb stepped out of the driver's side. 3 soldiers got out behind him. All 4 of them were in Army service uniforms, the Army Green Service uniform, pressed, correct, all insignia in their proper positions. Webb scanned the yard once, the way he scans any unfamiliar environment, quickly, completely without visible effort. He located me near the fence. He walked through the gate at a measured pace, not hurrying, because Webb does not hurry even in situations that would cause other people to run. He stopped in front of me. He came to attention. He said, "General Klein." "We're here, ma'am." The yard was completely quiet. I heard the charcoal cooling. I heard a crow somewhere in the trees beyond the back field. I heard Derek, 2 yards behind me, not say a single word. Webb turned to Derek. He identified himself fully. Name, rank, role, command. He explained in the measured and unhurried manner of a man who has managed volatile situations on multiple continents that the individual in restraints was a 2-star Army general currently in lawful personal travel, that the county easement dispute was a civil matter outside the scope of law enforcement authority, and that Derek would want to remove the restraints at this time. Derek said something about jurisdiction. Webb heard him out without expression. Then Webb said, "Deputy, the restraints, please." Derek's hands were not steady. I watched his face go through several things in quick succession. Recognition, confusion, the beginning of something that might become understanding later if he allowed it. He unclipped the key from his duty belt. He fumbled it once. The family was completely still. The only sound was the key finding the mechanism and the cuffs releasing. I rolled my wrists, I straightened my blouse. I looked at Derek, not for a long time, and not with any of the emotions he might have been braced for. Not with triumph or satisfaction or contempt. I looked at him the way I look at situations that have resolved themselves. Clearly, briefly, and then I moved on. I thanked Webb. He said, "Of course, General." I crossed the yard to where Carol was standing near the picnic table, with both hands pressed over her mouth and tears on her face. I told her it was okay. She started to say something, my name, then something else that didn't form, and I told her again that it was okay, that it had passed, that I would call her later. I looked at Lily on the porch steps. She was crying without sound, the specific kind of crying that happens when tension releases all at once. And I held her gaze long enough that she knew I had seen what she did and that it mattered. Then I walked through the gate. Webb's soldiers fell in behind me. The gate closed. The drive back to Washington was quiet. Webb did not ask questions, and I did not offer information, and after about an hour, I looked out the window at the Virginia farmland going dark in the early evening and felt, very slowly, the afternoon begin to settle into its right shape in my chest. Not lighter, more settled. Like a fact that had been hovering unconfirmed for years had finally become certain. Aunt Carol called 3 days later. She cried from the beginning of the call, and she apologized with the genuine distress of a 70-year-old woman who had stood at a picnic table and watched something happen to her niece and had not moved. I told her it was okay. I told her it had passed quickly. I heard her hear those words as forgiveness, and I let that stand, because what she needed in that moment was not a precise accounting of how I felt. She is 70 years old, and she has lost her husband, and she was not my target. The day after Carol's call, Derek's radio call caught up with him. The county reviewed the incident report and determined that the Harmon Carter easement was a private civil matter, not within the scope of county law enforcement authority, and that the detainment had had no legal basis. Derek was placed on a 3-day unpaid suspension pending formal review. He called me the afternoon he received the suspension notice. He said, "This is your fault. You knew who you were. You let me make a fool of myself." I said, "I asked you to remove the handcuffs." You said, "Or what?" He hung up. I went back to the readiness assessment I had been working on before his call came in, and I finished it, and it was complete and accurate, and that is what I did with the rest of that afternoon. Lily sent a long message later that evening. She explained that she had made the call, that she had not known it would bring soldiers in uniform, but that she had not known what else to do. She said she was sorry if it had made things worse. I wrote back one line, "You did the right thing. That's all that matters." She replied with a series of characters that I read as relief. I put the phone face down and slept better than I had in several weeks. Other family members reached out across the following week. Rick called to say that he had thought about saying something to Derek and hadn't quite gotten there in time. 2 cousins texted to say they wanted me to know they thought the whole thing had been wrong. One cousin did not contact me at all, which told me what I needed to know. I responded to each briefly, without warmth, but without coldness either. I harbor no particular anger toward the people who stood in the yard and said nothing. They made a choice in a moment that asked something of them. That choice is theirs to carry. It is not my responsibility to carry it for them. Derek called a second time in September, 6 weeks after the suspension. His voice had changed. The defensiveness was largely gone, replaced by something more lost and harder to manage. He said he didn't know what he had been trying to prove out there. He said the family had been different with him since the BBQ, that conversations stopped when he walked into rooms, that his mother looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. He said he was not sleeping well. He said he had not known about my rank, which was true, and that he supposed that meant something. I said, "You're right that you didn't know my rank." He started to say that still didn't mean he should have, and stopped. I waited. He said he didn't know how to finish the sentence. I said, "No, you shouldn't have. And I'm willing to leave it there for now." He said, "Okay." We stayed on the line for another moment without either of us saying anything. Then we ended the call. He didn't know my rank. That part is factually accurate, and I will not use it against him. But he knew at minimum that I was a person. He had known me since he was 2 years old. He had spent a summer afternoon at 13 watching fireflies with me from the oak tree and asking me whether I thought there were fish in the drainage pond. And I had answered him patiently because he was young and curious and I had liked him. He did not need my rank to understand that what he was doing was wrong. The rank was not the variable. I know this, and I think at some level, he knows it too. Whether he can do anything useful with that knowledge is a question for the years ahead of him. It is not a question I'm going to hold open, waiting for an answer. I have a photograph on the shelf in my apartment. One of several from family gatherings, the kind of artifact you accumulate over decades without particularly meaning to, and that end up holding the record of who you were in years you can no longer access any other way. In this particular photograph, taken in the summer of 1999, I am 21 years old, and Derek is 13. We are at the oak tree on Carol's property. He is looking at me with the unguarded expression of a child who believes that the person he is looking at knows something important that he doesn't know yet and is grateful to be nearby. I am looking somewhere off camera. I look completely relaxed. I look like a person who has the whole evening ahead of her and no particular reason to be anywhere else. I looked at that photograph for a long time in September. I didn't move it, I didn't take it down, I just looked at it until I had seen what it contained, and then I set it back on the shelf and went to bed. In September, I traveled to the Pentagon for a readiness briefing, my command's assessment presented to 3 other general officers and 2 members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I presented clearly, answered every question without deflection, and at the end of the session, a senator from Wisconsin, who had served in the Army herself, she left as a colonel, went to law school, went to the Senate, and has been on armed services for 11 years, caught my eye as the room was standing, and nodded once. Not a nod of congratulations, a nod of recognition, the kind that does not require any translation. I packed my materials and thanked the room and walked out. I ate lunch on a bench in the courtyard outside the building. I had 45 minutes and no calls, a sandwich from the cafeteria and September sun and nothing I needed to do. I sat there and let the summer run through my mind, the readiness exercise, the BBQ, the drive home, the calls and the texts and the September conversation with Derek. And I understood, sitting there in the sunlight, something I had been approaching for a long time without quite landing. I have spent most of my adult life managing other people's comfort around my own success. I drove 4 hours to Derek's academy graduation in 2010 because I thought maintaining the relationship required it. I attended every BBQ and every Christmas and every family event that I could reach by car or by plane without missing a critical operational commitment because I believed that presence was what kept the connection alive. I showed up in civilian clothes every time, kept my rank out of every conversation, let the comments pass without correction, and told myself that this was a form of generosity. What I understand now, not with bitterness, just with clarity, is that what I was actually doing was carrying a weight that was never mine alone to carry. And that by carrying it so completely, I had made it possible for the relationship to persist well past the point where it served either of us. I was managing the distance for everyone. I was the only one managing it. And when I finally set it down, on a July afternoon with handcuffs on my wrists, the people I had been protecting it for simply watched. I am not angry. This is important, and I want to be precise about it. Anger is the emotion of someone who has been surprised, and I was not surprised. Disappointed, yes, disappointed in the specific way you are disappointed when something you have been hoping was not true finally confirms itself, but not surprised. The facts had been available for a long time. I had simply been choosing not to act on them, and the handcuffs removed that option. Lily came to see me at the end of September. She drove up from JMU on a Saturday morning, and we sat at a coffee shop near my command for 2 hours and talked. Not about the BBQ, or not only about the BBQ. She told me about her coursework, about the professor who taught negotiation theory, about a paper she was writing on information asymmetry in allied intelligence sharing that was genuinely interesting, and that I gave her 2 references for that I thought might be useful. She asked me things about my career that nobody in the family had ever asked, what it was actually like to lead a large organization, what the hardest part of intelligence work was, whether I ever second-guessed assessments I had made. I told her things I had never told anyone in the family. Not classified, just real. The weight of being responsible for decisions that other people make with information your team gathered. The discipline of staying level when everything around you is not. The specific kind of loneliness that comes with not being able to discuss the most significant parts of your work with the people closest to you. She listened the way I used to listen under the oak tree, with her whole attention and nothing performed. At some point, she asked why I had never just told the family what my rank was. I told her that rank isn't who I am. It's what I do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought she understood that. I believed her. I walked back from the coffee shop through a September afternoon that was cool and entirely uncrowded and mine. My phone had 3 messages when I checked it near my building: a status update from my command duty officer, a note from a colleague about a briefing the following week, and a photo from Lily, a shot she'd taken through her car window on the drive home, a sunset in strips of orange and gray above the interstate. No caption. I looked at it for a moment and put my phone in my pocket and walked the rest of the way home. This is what I want to tell you, and it is the only part of the story I'm certain about. There comes a point, and I am not able to tell you when it arrives because it arrives differently for different people, where you stop waiting for the people who failed you to finally understand what they missed. You stop not because you have forgiven them, and not because you have decided they are beyond forgiving, but because you understand that their understanding is not actually what you have been waiting for. Underneath the waiting, there has been something more fundamental: the desire to have been seen. The desire to have someone in the yard, on any of the years you showed up, step forward and say your name like it meant what it actually means. And once you understand that this recognition, the real kind, the kind that doesn't require a uniform or a title or 4 soldiers stepping through a gate, is not something another person can give you, you stop waiting for them to give it. It was always yours. You were always already in possession of it. The quiet comes in, and the quiet is complete, and the quiet is everything that revenge never manages to be. There is a version of this story that I have told myself over the years, a cleaner version, the one you construct when you are still in the middle of something and need it to make sense. In that version, I was simply a private person who valued discretion, and the family's misunderstanding of my career was a neutral fact, the kind of consequence you accept without resentment when you choose a classified profession. In that version, the BBQ was an anomaly, a bad afternoon that Derek caused and that would pass without lasting damage, the way family events sometimes do. I held that version for a long time. It was easier than the other one. The other version is the one I reached sitting on that bench outside the Pentagon with a sandwich I was not entirely tasting. In the other version, I had been running a performance for 26 years. Not a lie, exactly. Nothing I had said was false. But I had been presenting a curated absence, showing up, being warm, deflecting questions, letting comments pass, maintaining the surface of the relationship without examining what the surface was sitting on. I had done this because I told myself it protected people I loved. And it did protect them, in the short term, from the discomfort of confronting the gap. But in the long term, it had protected them from accountability too. And that distinction matters. I think about the year I was selected for Brigadier General. I was 41 years old. The selection board process for general officers is not announced publicly. You learn through official channels, you process it, and then you make a series of decisions about who to tell and when. I told my parents, I told a small number of colleagues who were in my professional orbit. I did not tell my extended family because I knew that doing so would require a conversation I was not prepared to have. A conversation about why they hadn't known sooner, about what exactly I did, about the years of vague answers and changed subjects. It was easier not to. I chose easier, and I understand now that choosing easier, repeated enough times, becomes a structural fact. I am also aware, sitting with this honestly, that not all of my silence was about protecting others. Some of it was about protecting myself. It is uncomfortable to be the person who must explain their own importance. It is uncomfortable to be the person who says, in effect, I am not who you have been treating me as. There is a kind of pride in not needing to say it, in trusting that the work speaks for itself in the rooms where it actually matters. And there is, I think, a kind of cowardice in mistaking that pride for wisdom. Not a catastrophic cowardice, I do not judge myself harshly for it, but an honest accounting requires me to name it. What I wish I had understood earlier is that the silence was not neutral. Silence is never simply the absence of information. In a relationship, silence is a form of management, and management accumulates, and eventually it costs you. The handcuffs were the cost. I paid it, and then I was done. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the 40 minutes. About midway through, when the charcoal had been gray for a while and the conversation among the watching family members had taken on the particular quality of people trying to appear absorbed in something else, I thought about a training exercise I had run in 2015 at Fort Huachuca with a group of junior intelligence officers. The exercise involved placing the participants in situations where their assessment of a scenario was being undermined by people with apparent authority and asking them to hold their position when the pressure to capitulate was significant. What we found, consistently, was that the officers who held their positions most steadily were not the ones who were most confident in their own judgment in the abstract. They were the ones who had learned, through practice, to separate the discomfort of the social pressure from the validity of the information. They knew the discomfort was real. They knew the validity was also real. They could hold both without letting the discomfort win. I thought about that in the yard. I thought, I have been training people for years to do exactly what I'm doing right now. Stand here. Don't fight. Don't explain. Trust what you know. Let the situation reach its own conclusion. That is not a dramatic thought. It did not feel dramatic when I had it. It felt quiet and a little wry, the way things feel when you recognize a pattern you've spent a career teaching. I almost smiled. Not for anyone watching. For myself. Webb told me later, on the drive home, that when Lily's call came through to the command line, it had been routed to the duty officer, who had immediately escalated it. The duty officer's response time was under 2 minutes. Webb had been wheels up from the installation within 8. The 40-minute gap between the handcuffs going on and the vehicle arriving in the driveway represents the outer edge of how fast the system can move when the system is motivated to move. Webb said this not as a boast, but as a practical observation, the way he delivers most practical observations, flatly and completely and without apparent emotional coloring. I told him I thought he had moved well. He said he had not been given a choice, which is probably the most accurate thing either of us said during that drive. I want to say something about Derek that is true and that I think is important. He is not a bad man. I want to be clear about that because the story, as I've told it, has a shape that might suggest otherwise, and the shape is misleading if I'm not careful. Derek is a person who was given, at 24, a small amount of institutional authority in a community he grew up in, and who organized his identity around that authority over the 15 years that followed, because nothing else in his life expanded to fill the same space. He is good at his job, from what I understand. The sheriff's office review that followed the suspension found no other incidents of procedural overreach in his record. He is professionally a reasonable and competent county law enforcement officer. What he lacks, and what the badge did not give him and that nothing else has given him yet, is a sense of himself that exists independent of the authority the badge confers. That is not a character flaw. It is a circumstance. It is the circumstance of a person who never found the thing he was built for, or who found it and is still working out what it means. I know what I'm built for. That has not always made me an easy person to be around. I know that too. When Lily and I had coffee in September, she asked me at one point whether I was lonely. She asked it directly, the way she asks everything, without softening it into something more comfortable. I thought about it for a moment. I said I was sometimes. She asked whether the career was worth the loneliness. I said that was not how I thought about it, that the career and the loneliness were not a transaction, that the work was not compensation for something I had given up, that the question of worth presupposed a trade that I had not experienced it as. She thought about that. She said she thought she understood, but that she was also going to keep thinking about it, which seemed right. She is 19, and she is already asking the questions it took me decades to formulate. I hope she gets better answers than I did, which is to say I hope she gets them sooner. I drove back from the Pentagon briefing on a Tuesday in late September. It was a clear afternoon, and the traffic was light for that corridor, and I made it in just over an hour. I parked in the underground structure and walked to the elevator and rode it up to my floor. And when I came into the apartment, I stood in the doorway for a moment before I reached for the light switch. The apartment was the particular kind of quiet that a well-ordered room has at the end of a working day. Not empty, not lonely, just still. Waiting for whoever lives in it to come home and inhabit it again. I crossed to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood at the window looking out over the installation lights and the tree line beyond the fence and a thin strip of evening sky above the ridge. I had the photograph of me and Derek at the oak tree in my line of sight. I didn't look at it directly. I looked past it, at the sky. The quiet held. I thought, this is enough. Not as a settling for, not as a consolation, as an actual statement of sufficiency. The apartment, the glass of water, the strip of September sky, the work waiting for me in the morning. Lily's photograph of a sunset with no caption. The nod from the senator, which I had not been expecting and which I will probably remember for a long time. The way Webb had walked through that gate without hurrying, because he is good at what he does, and he knew exactly what the situation required. These things together. This is a life. If someone in your life has been telling you, in one form or another, that you don't count, that your work doesn't count, that your standing doesn't count, that the rules don't apply to them when it comes to how they treat you, I want you to hear this. You do not have to argue with them. You do not have to prove yourself to them. You do not have to arrive one day in a uniform with 2 stars on the shoulder, and you do not have to wait for a sergeant to walk through the gate. You are allowed to simply stop. You are allowed to be done. You are allowed to stand near a fence on a July afternoon in a plain blouse with your hands in handcuffs and know, without saying a word to anyone, exactly who you are. Because that knowledge was never in the handcuffs. It was never in the badge. It was never in the yard, in the audience, in the faces of the people who watched and said nothing. It was in you the whole time. You have always already been in possession of it. The quiet is there when you're ready. There's something else about the years between Derek's badge ceremony and the BBQ that I have not fully accounted for, and it sits with me now as something that has to be named clearly. I was not passive. I made a choice, repeatedly and with full awareness, to not disrupt the social equilibrium of those gatherings by asserting anything about myself. I made that choice because I told myself it was the generous thing, the low-drama thing, the thing that a person of genuine confidence does. They don't need external validation. They don't perform their credentials in front of family. They show up and eat potato salad and let the afternoon be what it is. And all of that is technically true. A person of genuine confidence does not need external validation. But a person of genuine confidence also does not spend 26 years carefully calibrating their self-presentation to avoid causing discomfort in people who are, at some level, choosing comfort over honesty. That is not confidence. That is accommodation. And accommodation, offered endlessly, teaches people that their comfort is the thing that needs to be protected. I taught Derek, by 26 years of polite deflection, that my feelings about his comments were not something that required his attention. I did not intend to teach him this. I was not conscious of teaching him this. But behavior is what it does, not what it means, and what my behavior did, over and over, was confirm for Derek that there were no consequences to dismissing me. That the dynamic he was running, visible authority over invisible work, badge over blank, was acceptable and would remain acceptable indefinitely. The handcuffs were the logical endpoint of a lesson I had accidentally been delivering for decades. I do not blame myself for this, but I do take responsibility for it, which is different. There is also the question of what would have happened if Lily had not made the call, if the contact number had not been on the card, if the card had been lost, or if Lily had not kept it in her phone case for 6 years against the improbable chance that she might need it. If the voice on the other end had not been calm and competent and had not dispatched Webb inside 8 minutes. What would I have done if the government vehicle had not come up the driveway? I would have waited until Derek decided to release me, or until another law enforcement officer arrived and assessed the situation and released me. Or until enough time passed that the situation became embarrassing enough that Derek made a calculation about costs. Any of those outcomes would have occurred within hours. I would have walked out of the yard. I would have driven home. The family would have known what they had witnessed and would have carried it forward into every subsequent gathering, which means the subsequent gatherings would have been different, which means the relationship would have changed anyway. The government vehicle made it change faster and more completely, and it made it change publicly, which I think is the part that matters most. Not for me, I did not need the public element, but for the record. For what was now in the county's file and in the family's collective memory and in Derek's understanding of what he had done. The vehicle made the consequences proportionate. Webb is very good at that. My parents know what happened. I told them in August after the suspension had been resolved and the formal review closed. My father was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said, "Why didn't you ever tell us? About the rank, about what you do?" I said I had wanted the gatherings to be about the family, not about me, and that keeping my rank out of the room had seemed like the right way to do that. He said, "Natalie, you are the family. You didn't have to keep yourself out of it for it to work. I don't know that I fully agree, but I know he meant it, and I told him so. The farm will still be there next summer. The oak tree will still be there, with its particular smell after rain. The backfield will still have fireflies in it when the light goes. I do not know yet whether I will be there with them. I am not closing a door. I am simply not going to hold it open with my hands anymore. If I go back, it will be because I want to be there and because the people there have done the work to make it somewhere I want to be. That is a reasonable standard. I think most people would agree it is a reasonable standard. The only unusual thing about it is that it took me 47 years to apply it to myself. Lily and I have been in regular contact since September. She texts me articles she finds interesting, academic pieces on intelligence theory, occasionally something about Army history, once a recipe she thought I might like, which I made on a Sunday evening and which was genuinely good. I text her back. We are having a real conversation, the kind where both people are present for it. She is 19 years old, and she is one of the most perceptive people I know, and I am grateful that she kept that card in her phone case. And I am grateful that she walked behind the barn and made the call without knowing exactly what it would set in motion, and I am grateful that she drove up on a Saturday in September to sit across a coffee shop table and ask me questions nobody else had thought to ask. Some people see you clearly from the beginning. She always did. I just didn't know it until it mattered. If you've made it this far, you already know how this ended. And I hope what you take from it isn't the moment the handcuffs came off. I hope you take what came after. The bench outside the Pentagon, the coffee with Lily, the apartment at night, quiet in the way a life can be quiet when you finally stopped carrying something that was never yours to carry alone. I want to ask you something. Have you ever kept yourself smaller in a room because you thought it would make the people in it more comfortable? Have you ever shown up for someone year after year and let things pass that you shouldn't have let pass? And what did it take for you to stop? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and if this story meant something to you, subscribe and leave a like. It helps more than you know.